All right, good morning to my AC2 students. Today we are going to be going over together the first section of your notes on the civil rights movement. Quick little bit of housekeeping stuff. Your civil rights movement test is probably going to be somewhere in the middle of next week because I'm going to have a couple of assignments here for you throughout the week. You guys did really good on the Emmett Till questions. For those of you guys that turned it in, I'm still waiting on a few of those for some of you, which means you guys are going to be starting to lose points, if not get zeros. And same thing for the drill that I gave you guys over the weekend. I'm looking over those and grading those today. So keep checking your grade book throughout the day today. You should be receiving those grades for that throughout the day today. So if you could open up your PowerPoint notes to where it says Chapter 21 Civil Rights Movement, and then we're going to get started on the slide right underneath that where it says Brown versus the Board of Education. Okay, so I told you guys last week that in my opinion, the civil rights movement started with the murder of Emmett Till. And if you looked at the documentary and the questions and all those sorts of things, you can see where I'm coming from with that. That does not mean that things started before that. They did. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is Brown versus the Board of Education. Before 1951, a lot of schools, not all, but a lot, were completely segregated. So you would have an all-white school, you would have an all-black school. If you look at the way the school you go to, there's kids of different races, different ethnicities, all sorts of things. Wasn't that way 60, 70, 80 years ago. Now, I believe Chartiers was always a desegregated school, but there was a lot of schools throughout the country that only whites were allowed to go to one school, only blacks were allowed to go to others. So, the court case of Brown versus the Board of Education attempts to change all that. So, in 1951, Oliver Brown, who is a father, sues the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education to allow his 8-year-old daughter to attend an all-white school. So, here's the deal with all that. Mr. Brown has to work, so he has to leave early to go to work. His daughter can go to a school that's just a few blocks away, where she leaves her house, she walks a few blocks, she's at school. Problem is, it's an all-white school. She can't go there. So she has to walk a lot farther to get to the school she's supposed to go. Not only does she have to walk farther, it's not as good of a school. They're not getting as good of an education. The teachers aren't as highly qualified. It's just not as good of a school. And Mr. Brown's like, why should my daughter suffer? Why should she not get the quality education that other kids are getting just because of the color of her skin? So he ends up suing the Kansas Board of Education. And a few years later, May 17, 1954, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in a unanimous decision, the court declares that separate but equal is unconstitutional. Not just schools, but just the idea. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson? Separate but equal. We're going to keep the races separate. It's cool. It's legal. This is saying, no, it's not. So you would think with this court case saying separate but equal is now unconstitutional, that's it. It's done. The separation of the races is over. Blacks and whites are going to be together. It's not the case. They still found many, many ways to try to find loopholes in this. And this is one of the main things we're going to talk about this chapter, all right? Go down to the next slide where it says reaction to the ruling. The reaction to this ruling was mixed. And you would think that African Americans would be jumping for joy. White people would be angry. Not necessarily, all right? Obviously, African Americans rejoiced. This was a monumental victory for them. And many white people accepted it too. Either they were happy about it because they felt that segregation was terrible, or they just didn't care. They just went on with their lives. The white people that were angry was a lot of white people in the South. And not necessarily just angry. They were also fearful. Now, why would they be fearful? Well, you can look at the systematic oppression they have had towards African Americans since the end of the Civil War. And maybe they're a little bit worried that African Americans are going to want to extract some sort of revenge on them. For all the years of oppression they did towards African Americans, maybe now African Americans are going to say, we want our revenge. So they were a little worried about that. The governor of Georgia said he's not going to tolerate the ruling. He doesn't care what the ruling is. There's still going to be segregation. And the KKK became more active. And when we talk about the Ku Klux Klan, when are they most active? When are they doing the most? Well, it's usually in times of additional rights being given to African Americans and other minority groups. If segregation is fully in place and African Americans are always looked at as second class citizens, well, the Klan isn't really rallying that much because there's no need to. But when these things start happening, Klan activity starts sprouting up, and we're going to be looking at that throughout the next couple weeks as well. 90 congressmen throughout the country says it violated states' rights to where if, say, Pennsylvania wants to be desegregated, blacks and whites are equal, they can go to the same schools, same movie theaters, whatever, that's fine. But if we're Alabama and we want to be segregated, well, then we're going to be segregated. They felt that it was states' rights. It is our right to decide how we are going to do that, okay? All right, go down to the next slide where it says Montgomery bus boycott. All of you should know about this, right? This is one of the most historical moments in the civil rights movement, if not American history. 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus. She worked all day. She was tired. She was just this little lady. And a white guy got on the bus, told her to move to the back. She refused to do it. So she's arrested for what they say is violating states' rights. Here's the thing about this, though, and I'm not trying to take away anything that she did. I would never do that. She wasn't the first person to do this, all right? There were other people in the past that refused to give up their seats that were arrested. So what made Rosa Parks so different? Whether this is fair, unfair, or whatever, you got to remember, this is a little lady who was being arrested, being handcuffed, because after a full day of work, she was tired and she didn't want to give up her seat. She's a very sympathetic character to where it's easy to rally behind her. Last week when we looked at Emmett Till was not the first person to be lynched in Mississippi. Remember what they said when he went missing? They said, check the rivers, because that's where most African Americans end up when things like this happen. He wasn't the first. She wasn't the first. But they are very easily sympathetic figures that's very easy to rally around. And people really did rally around her. Okay, her arrest led to what was known as the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, this was a sacrifice for a lot of African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. They refused to use the entire bus system until they were completely desegregated. Now, that's how many of them had to get to work. They didn't quit their jobs. They would have to then walk to work or hopefully maybe get a ride, but they refused to ride the bus system. Now, you would figure a lot of white people at first would probably be like, oh, hey, good, don't ride it. We would rather you not ride it anyway. But black people made up over half of the people that rode the buses. So you're cutting the revenue in half. So while at first it may have seemed like, okay, fine, don't ride the bus, it severely, severely hurt the bus system in Alabama. Over the next year, 50,000 African Americans refused to ride the buses. And in 1956, a year later, the Supreme Court rules that bus segregation is unconstitutional. So if you're black, if you're white, you can sit wherever you want on the bus now. Once again, it didn't mean whenever this was passed or the ruling was laid out that everything was fine. But these were major, major steps in the right direction. Okay. Next slide, resistance in Little Rock. 1957. This is, I don't want to say one of my favorite stories or one of my favorite things that happened, but sometimes it's funny when things blow up in people's faces for the wrong reasons. In 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Favis, I love that name, orders the National Guard to turn away 9 African American students who were supposed to attend school that year. This school was about to be desegregated. Governor Favis said, it's not, all right? We're still going to have segregated schools. And he orders the National Guard. He says, listen, you guys are going to stop the black students from coming in, okay? So there's angry protesters there trying to prevent the black students from entering the school. So you have protesters trying to stop the African Americans from coming in, and obviously you had supporters there as well. So what happens is the President Eisenhower, sees all this. And he calls the National Guard in Alabama, and he says, you are now under federal command. So you are now under my command. And I am now giving you orders to protect these students, to assist them into going to class. And Favis is like irate about this. He's calling the president and he's like, hey, I ordered them to stop. And Eisenhower's like, yeah, I ordered them to help them. And Favis is probably like, who are you to take over my National Guard? And Eisenhower's like, I'm the President of the United States. So Favis does everything he can to keep the black students from entering school. Eisenhower then puts the National Guard under his authority and orders them to assist them into going to class. All right? Now, last slide for today, slide number 7. When we talk civil rights, obviously the main group we talk about is African Americans. There were other groups fighting for their civil rights back then, even still to this day. And one group were the Latin Americans. And in 1929, which is years and years before the time period we're talking about now, the United Latin American Citizens Group was created. Similar to African American groups that were fighting for civil rights, this was just for Latin Americans. One of their biggest cases happened with a soldier that fought in World War II. His name was Felix Longoria. The state of Texas refused to bury him, and by bury him, like a full military burial. And, the ULAC protested. They said, this is a veteran. This is a guy that fought for the United States. He should get a full military burial. And Texas said, it doesn't matter. He's not. So the ULAC protests, and if you go to Washington, D.C. today, if you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery, after their protest, after their demand for his and all Latin Americans equal rights, Felix Longoria was given a full military burial in Arlington National Cemetery. So if you're ever in Washington, D.C., and you have the time to look for it, you can find his tombstone. It is there to this day. It's a really, really cool story. All right. Now, guys, that is the first day of our notes for the civil rights movement. There's going to be more of my YouTube videos where you're seeing my bald head explaining more of this stuff to you as the week goes on. Remember, about the middle of next week, you guys are going to have your civil rights test, but we are going to have some activities throughout the week and early next week on it as well. So keep staying tuned to that. Also, get your Emmett Till questions in. Get your drill question in. I'm going to start docking points. I will start giving zeros if they're not. Most of you guys have turned them in. Most of you guys have done a great job. For those of you guys that didn't, get it into me. All right? If you have any questions, shoot me a chat. Remember, individual chats, I get the notifications when it's in the group message. I don't necessarily get them, so I see those when I see those. Questions, comments, concerns, please hit me up on all that stuff. All right? Guys, have a great day. Be talking to you guys soon. Bye.